I'm Louise Bazalgette, Deputy Director of Nesta's A Fairer Start mission, and I'll be chairing this event today. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. For anyone who isn't familiar with Nesta, we're an innovation agency that supports innovation for social good, and our A Fairer Start mission aims to close the school readiness gap between disadvantaged children and their peers. And alongside our mission aims, being inclusive is one of Nesta's core values. It's really important for us to think about how our work in the early years can be inclusive and improve outcomes for children from all different types of backgrounds. So I'm really delighted to welcome Liz Pemberton to this Nesta Talks 2 event to discuss the role of early years services in tackling discrimination and enabling all children to thrive. Liz is the director of the Black Nursery Manager Limited. This is a training and consultancy company which helps early years leaders and practitioners to develop inclusive and anti-racist practice. So thank you so much for joining us, Liz.
Thank you, Louise.
Lovely to have you with us here today. So the idea of this event is it's meant to be interactive. So if anyone watching wants to ask Liz a question, please do put it in the chat. But I'll just get us kick-started off with a question. So Liz, please could you start by telling us a bit more about your professional background and what led to you establishing your company, the Black Nursery Manager?
Yeah, absolutely. So I've worked in education all in all now for about 17, 18 years, actually, because obviously we've had these 2 years out through COVID. And initially I started working in the early years as a nursery manager located in Birmingham, which is where I'm from, in case people can tell from my warm, brummy tones, and kind of thought about the ways in which early years was this foundation that bridged gaps in terms of communities, understanding families, thinking about working with people in general, and how we brought together lots of different elements of what. And so it was really interesting because when I started in the early years, it was a very different landscape, but I was always interested in education. And so thinking about the research side of what early years was about, I went and did a master's degree and looked at the expectations that practitioners had of Black African Caribbean children, primarily in the city of Birmingham, but really thinking about what that meant for later attainment and achievement and self-esteem and self-perception for Black children. And was also then interested in thinking about the workforce who was coming into the early years. So I qualified as a secondary teacher and taught health and social care and childcare. My first degree was in drama, so I taught drama as well in a local girls' school. And again, that was really, really exciting for me because I was able to shape and influence the minds, as I said, of the workforce. So did that for a few years, came back into the early years space. And then, as I said, really started thinking very closely about community, families, children, and how we kind of amplify narratives that are often really kind of unheard, because we think about words like disaffection and under-resourced, and where my nursery was located bordered two very different demographics in terms of socioeconomic status and ethnicity. And it was really interesting to see who the early years space was catering to. And by that, I mean, just in terms of like the emotional environment as well as the physical environment, and thinking about those identity markers and those access points for different people, different communities, different children and families. So I had done that, as I said, up until 2020, up until the start of the lockdown, where I had decided that actually I was looking at some of the things in terms of the structures and the systems that govern the early years, and decided actually I'd had enough. I wanted to think about the way in which the impact of some of the things that I had been doing in the setting with my various staff teams, how could I get this message out about the importance of having a really different approach when it comes to cultural competency, thinking about serving specific children and families, and also what it meant to be racially minoritized and racially marginalized in my city. And some of the things that we did in our nursery really lent themselves to helping and supporting communities which were otherwise really overlooked. And it was really interesting because in a city like Birmingham, which prides itself on being really racially and ethnically diverse, and talks a lot about community cohesion, it's really interesting that that only seems to exist in certain pockets of the city. And there's still places in this city where you could go and it's all white, you know, places that you could go in this city and it is, you know, all Black, and thinking about the way in which we talk about communities and talk about cohesion and talk about the ways in which children and families access quality provision, I realised that wasn't always supported by the city, local authority, and also by the structures and systems that govern and regulate early years, namely Ofsted. And so it really got me thinking about how are these systems and structures actually put in place to support early years provisions, the diverse range of early years provisions that are out there. And so when I decided to close the nursery, that was following a really traumatic and interesting inspection that we'd had by Ofsted, which made me really think, as I said, about the ways in which work has to be done at a structural level to really understand the diversity of pedagogy. How do we cater to the needs of children? There is not a one approach fits all. There are different ways in which you are to engage with children and families, and it won't always be the pre-prescribed method as governed by, the regulatory body or the local authority or your early years support worker. It looks different. And so it was really interesting looking at how, when those systems and structures get involved with governing, how those outcomes can impact the quote unquote most disadvantaged children and families. Because I realised this is not a system that's set up to support, protect, and encourage settings like mine, which were predominantly Black and brown. And so when I thought about ways in which I could move this out of the four walls of a nursery, if you like, I thought really carefully about anti-racist practice, but particularly anti-racist practice in the early years space. And so in July of 2020, I decided to set up the Black Nursery Manager Training and Consultancy, which specialises in providing support, assistance, training, guidance in anti-racist practice within the early years specifically, and what that looks like, not just on an interpersonal level, but in a structural and systemic way as well. And to that end, the business has absolutely snowballed, like far further than I could have ever imagined in terms of the reach of my work, and also just the ripple effect that it's having, writing articles, engaging with local authorities up and down the UK, and also now internationally, thinking about some of the conversations that I'm having with nursery managers from the private, voluntary and independent sector, but also nurseries that are attached to schools as well, thinking about reception classes, key stage 1 classes, senior leadership in schools, and also as well play schemes, childminders. The range of work and the reach has been phenomenal, because I think people are thirsty for this conversation. They want to know what it is that needs to be done on a wide level around really getting to the crux of what it means to be actively anti-racist in the early years space, instead of paying lip service to what people perceive to be, diversity or multiculturalism, and thinking more expansively about what that could be and how transformational that could be as well for children and families.
Well, thank you so much, Liz. It's so interesting to hear about that journey and about how you got here today. So I actually wanted to ask you, as my first question following that, just the simple question really, for people who aren't like that familiar with the term anti-racism, could you sort of tell them, what do you mean by that?
Yeah, anti-racism, first of all, we need to be really clear. It's about doing. It's not about saying. And I think a lot of conversation and dialogue has been happening, particularly over the past 2 years, about anti-racist practice or anti-racism. And words like allyship have been thrown up, words like decolonization, things around looking at curriculum. All of these things have kind of come into the conversations that we are having. But anti-racism is about the doing, the analysing, the understanding, and the ways in which white supremacy plays a part in our everyday lives, and not being fearful around terms like white supremacy, not being worried about not understanding it, and realising it's an individual task in the first instance, going out and doing that work where you're investigating what that means for you. Have you examined what racism is, what racism looks like if you've never been on the receiving end of it? Have you positioned yourself, if you're racialized as white, as being a learner and not a teacher? So listening to those voices that are racially minoritized or racially marginalized. Have you understood the impact of those experiences, what that means, as I said, on the day-to-day sense, but also as well in terms of life chances, and how, I guess, racism plays a part in shaping the way in which people who are racially minoritized navigate their lives, not just in education, but of course in healthcare, in housing, in a range of these different institutions. So thinking about it, as I said, as something that we know we need to do as a collective, but examining what it means to you firstly as an individual. It's introspective work, but it also requires us, as I said, to think about it collaboratively.
Absolutely. And also, you were talking obviously about your very hands-on role as nursery manager previously, and developing your own kind of anti-racist practice and working with practitioners on anti-racist practice. And could you tell us a bit about kind of what would that mean kind of practically sort of day-to-day in settings? What would anti-racist practice look like?
So one of the things that I had really thought about in terms of like anti-racism in the early years was this framework that I created called the 4 E's of anti-racist practice, which asks us to embrace, to embed, to ensure, to extend. And I hadn't thought about it in those terms kind of at the time, but as I moved away from nursery management and started formulating some of the work that I think should be happening in early years, I started thinking about this, the 4 E's of anti-racist practice. So, you know, embracing every child's racial, cultural and religious background, especially when they differ from your own. And in a practical sense, it's not just about that physical environment, putting up a poster, you know, having black dolls. It's about that emotional environment. So how do people feel? Is there a sense of belonging when people, children and families come into your setting? Not only do they see themselves represented, but do they feel as though they are valued in the space? So is there time given for children to talk about who they are? Are we listening to children? Are we really centering children as the non-statutory guidance that we have instructs us to do? Are we putting the child at the center of everything that we do? Or are we as adults still obsessed with trying to guide them, trying to tell them what they should do, instead of, as I said, positioning ourselves as learners and not teachers? Anti-racist practice is about thinking more expansively than having what I call these IKEA flat pack days where, okay, right, it's Eid, so we're going to do this. It's Diwali, so we're going to do that. Okay, it's Lunar New Year, so we're going to do this. Are we thinking more expansively and not attempting to reduce a whole diaspora's culture or religious celebrations into this one day so it becomes more than tokenistic? You know, we have to move away from tokenistic practices, which, as I said, pay lip service to what people interpret these festivals and these celebrations to be, and pay close attention to the children and the families that are in our setting, in our space, and also how children talk about themselves in that sense, in terms of their racial identity, in terms of their culture, in terms of, you know, their religion. Are we paying attention to all of the children, not just the some? Share our own racialized identities or share our cultural beliefs and values. So how are we really paying attention, listening to children, creating space for children, for all children, and doing that equitably?
Fantastic, thank you. That's very powerful. And we actually had a question in advance of this this session from Gail Remaker from City of London Sinfonia. And her question was, what's your advice on how to effectively engage with parents from different backgrounds and those children who may not know English at all or well?
Oh, I just cut out then, but I think I'm back now.
You're back. Yeah, I was just going to ask that question again. So our question submitted in advance from Gail Remaker was, what's your advice on how to effectively engage with parents from different backgrounds and those children who may not know English at all or well?
I think relationships are at the foundation of everything that we do, aren't they, in the early years? Relationships are important, and treating people as people, knowing that everybody's going to come to you with their own narrative, with their own lived experiences, and making sure that that respect is really at the foundation of these interactions, not making assumptions about who people are based on what you think, giving them time to speak about themselves. And as I said, if we know that children and families are multilingual or bilingual, how are you making sure that information is accessible for them? Are you just relying on, you know, things being in a different language? Are there, or is there ability for you to make sure that conversations are had in kind of private spaces if necessary as well? Thinking really empathetic about who the children and families are.
Absolutely. And then I just wanted to ask as well, just a kind of broad question, which is, what do you find most inspiring about working with children in the early years?
I just think people say this all the time, but no 2 days are the same. One of the things that I miss most about actually being a nursery manager and being in the setting is listening to children talking to me and thinking about how inquisitive 2-year-olds are, 3-year-olds are, 4-year-olds are, the kinds of questions that they ask and the kinds of information they want to share about who they are. And I think I was sharing one of the things with you, Louise, before about conversations about who I am and what I look like. Conversations pertaining to eyebrows, that was a big thing in my nursery. They would talk to me about my makeup. So, Liz, how come your eyebrows are a different shape? Or, oh, how do you get that glittery stuff on your eyelids? And children really being inquisitive and thinking about who you are and what you look like, and then relating that to themselves and their own extended family. I found most kind of exciting about working with children is just listening to them tell me who they are and giving them space to do that.
Fantastic. And our mission focus at Nesta is on closing the school readiness gap, and I think many people here today are also that's their aim as well, to ensure that all children can have good development. So I just wanted to ask you, how do you think we can shape our early years services to ensure that all children from all backgrounds can thrive?
So I think this is really a conversation and a question about, policy. And again, thinking very carefully about structures and systems, how these things are set up in the first place. And if we're really wanting to make things equitable and we're really wanting to make sure that all children and families thrive, what is happening at the very, very top? So we know we've had lots of conversation around, childcare not being affordable for all families, the way in which childcare is funded by our current government, the ways in which we allow or help children and families to access provision, quality provision, but also the way in which quality is decided upon. How are we thinking about that through lots of different lenses? Because as I said, it's not a one size fits all. And I think at the moment, the model and the system is not fit for purpose because it serves one particular demographic. And if we think about that using an intersectional approach, we also have to accept and understand it's massively ableist. Of course, it's racist. It's definitely, pitched to a particular socioeconomic group. And it means that lots of children and families then miss out. So it's never a system that's designed to be equitable or to be accessed by everybody. This model, as I said, is not fit for purpose, but it needs to be dismantled and rebuilt. That, I think, is something that people perhaps don't want to hear, but it's the truth insofar as what I have seen and experienced as somebody who's worked in the sector for a long time, who is coming to the sector from, this being something that my own mother, she joined the early years in the late 80s and started her business then, coming out of the early years in terms of being a nursery manager and moving into training and consultancy, and seeing things from so many different angles, the way in which the system is constantly failing specific groups of children and their families. It needs to be totally demolished as far as I'm concerned and rebuilt again, but rebuilt with perhaps different people sat around those tables making those decisions. Anti-racism looks at power and looks at the way in which power is distributed. And one of the things that anti-racism asks us to think about is who occupies those positions of power and how are we making sure that power and privilege, if you like, is dissected and spent. How is privilege spent? How are we looking at the people who are sat around those tables? And what are they bringing in terms of not just their academia or their research? What are they bringing in terms of their lived experience? So I always think, if we're going to have a board of directors, if we're going to have a group of people, should all of those people be white and male? No, they shouldn't. How are we going to change that? Yeah, we could bring in people of another gender, but if we're going to do that, are we going to limit it to just it being, male and female? What about our trans communities? What about our non-binary communities? Are we making sure that we have, as well as, white people, have we got people who are South Asian? Have we got people who are Black? Have we got people who are East and Southeast Asian sat at these tables? Because if we're thinking about a city like my own, Birmingham, all of those ethnicities, all of those communities make up this city. the children who are accessing provision are part of the communities that make up this city. And that is the case UK wide. So we have to really think about the decisions that are being made, because one specific demographic of people cannot make decisions for a diverse community and a diverse group of children who access our early years provisions.
Thank you. And in terms of like whose voices are heard and in about sort of inclusiveness of decision making and sort of equitable representation, I'll just wait to check that Liz is back with us. Can you hear me, Liz? Now, while we've just got a quick break, if anyone has any questions they would like to ask, it would be great if you could start thinking about those and putting them in the chat. Anything that kind of comes to mind that you'd like to hear Liz talk about a bit more, it would be absolutely lovely to hear any of those questions.
I'm back.
And we have Liz back with us. Brilliant. Lovely to be back, Liz. I was just encouraging people to put some questions in the chat while they're waiting. But yeah, I was just starting to ask you questions. So what you just were talking about, sort of how decisions are made and who's around the table and the importance of representation. I was just wondering, have you come across any sort of good examples of that, where you've seen kind of much more inclusive decision making or kind of involvement of communities? Have you sort of, is there anything that you would point to as like a good example?
Yeah, I think some of the things that I've been involved with on a kind of non-statutory element, policy-wise, being involved in the construction of the Birth to 5 Matters guidance was really interesting, because it kind of was something that was created by the sector for the sector. And also it meant that lots of different kinds of people who had worked in the early years and do work in the early years were informing what was happening in terms of non-statutory guidance that would support the ways in which teachers, practitioners, early years educators were doing their job. And to that end, the equalities and inclusion group, of which I was a part, thought really carefully about why we should be having conversations about race and thinking about anti-racist practice, and the need to have the conversations as a first step, and also the necessity for practitioner training in that area, was something that was really heartwarming for me to see feature in non-statutory guidance. That was, I think, a really good example, but it wasn't perfect. Of course, there were still voices that were excluded from that. And I'm thinking particularly about the East and Southeast Asian community in the UK, and the exclusion of those voices in that narrative and building around that. And I say that a lot because of the early years' obsession with, celebrating Lunar New Year. And I often think about the ways in which we've been told and trained and encouraged to celebrate something like Lunar New Year, when I have never seen somebody of East or Southeast Asian heritage instructing and directing that. Because I think if you're going to think about a community's way, as I said, of celebrating and acknowledging, surely somebody and people from that community should be influencing the ways in which that's done. And I think that's why we've got it so terribly wrong. And the same can be said, as I said, for Eid, the same can be said about Diwali. It's like there's a very limited, narrow lens through which we're seeing these things, which are constantly pumped out within the early years. I thought a lot about that and thought about the way in which we invite and understand and have inclusive practice. And perhaps, invite is the wrong word, because, as I said, there are people doing things all of the time in different communities. It's about bringing everybody together.
Looks like we're losing Liz again. Hopefully she'll be back with us in a minute. Please do keep your questions coming in. I can see one from Nikki Wilson, which I'll put to Liz when she's back. And I think we've got a few more popping up, which is brilliant. One from Mark. So do keep them coming. And as soon as Liz is back, we'll carry on the conversation. Liz, we lost you for a minute then.
Oh, okay. I hope that you heard me up until when I was saying Be Seen, the British East and Southeast Asian Network. which is an organisation, a grassroots organisation of 6 women who are of East and Southeast Asian heritage, contributing to making sure the conversation around how early year settings look at Lunar New Year is done appropriately and positively, and with a level of absolute, cultural sensitivity. I just thought about
we're a bit unlucky with our internet connection today, but hopefully it won't be long. And thank you for the questions coming in. I'll just read out Nikki's question. She's asked, given the significance of parents and early years in particular, does the work cross over to influencing home environments too? Liz, are you back? And we've had another question from Carly. She said, thanks so much for sharing this, Liz and Nesta. She says, family by family, they're working with 154 adults and kids in Stoke-on-Trent. Are you back, Liz?
I am. It's so frustrating. It's like it would happen now, wouldn't it? The internet connection seems to be really strange, but it was perfectly fine before. Sorry, I heard
it's typical, isn't it? No problem, you're back. I was just looking at some of the comments. So, and thank you for highlighting. Was it called Be Seen, the South Asian?
Yes, Be Seen.
Charity?
Yes.
Yeah. Thank you for mentioning that one. I'll check them out. So we had a question from Nikki Wilson, which was, given the significance of parents in the early years in particular, does the work cross over into influencing home environments too? I'm sure Liz will answer that question once she gets back to us. We also had, you're back, Liz.
Yeah, sorry.
Can you see that question from Nikki Wilson?
I can, yeah. Given the significance of parents in the early years in particular, does the work cross over into influencing home environments too? Absolutely. I think there's much work to be done in homes, and parents shouldn't see themselves excluded. Children are not afraid to have conversations. So if they talk about an element of difference between themselves and their friends, for instance, or people that they see in the general public as you're out and about as a parent, not shying away from those conversations. I think it's really important to talk about them in the same way we would if we think about disability. Children are very observant and they see things. If we respond in a way that gives children this feeling that they shouldn't talk about certain things, then it's going to really engender that, and it's not positive. I think we should be open to having a wide range of conversations with children. They are ready for conversations. They want to know. They are inquisitive beings, and we should always stoke their curiosity. And as I said, not shy away. Doesn't matter how difficult you might find it. It doesn't matter how uncomfortable you might find it. Children are competent. They're ready, and we need to kind of have that self-belief in ourselves as adults, as parents, as carers, as educators, but also have that self-belief with regards to your influence, your ability to help shape children and help them navigate the space. So I hope that answers the question, Nikki.
Thank you, Liz. And actually, for parents at home who really want to bring up their children comfortable talking about race and understanding what their role is to play in being anti-racist, are there any kind of books or resources that you'd recommend that they could read with their children?
Absolutely, there are a whole host, but one of the things that I always think of is use those books as scaffolds. Okay, so you use them to support the conversations that you're going to have. I wouldn't necessarily say, right, today we're going to have a lesson about talking about anti-racism, but think about the observation of your children in action. What are your children talking about? What are your children noticing? How are you then going to build on that conversation? If you're not used to talking about things to do with race or culture, ethnicity, the book by Laura Henry Elaine, My Skin, Your Skin, is one that I always advocate. There is another book that I should have got ready, but it's called Our Skin. Again, thinking about these ways in which you pitch conversations, children are literal. They see things and they'll notice things like, oh, her hair's that colour, my hair's this colour, that child's skin is that colour, my child's, my skin is this colour. So I think skin is always a nice place to start, and then bringing it back to the child. So thinking about being really reflective with your child, asking your child to think about what is their skin like, and can they draw a self-portrait using mirrors? And again, I would say age stage appropriate. So you wouldn't do this with a 6-month-old, but with a 2-year-old, a 3-year-old, a 4-year-old who's asking those questions, using mirror play is a beautiful way of kind of getting children to start thinking and talking about themselves in a confident way, in a positive way. And all children as well. This is not just specifically for, black and brown children. This is also for white children as well. It's really interesting, Louise, because when I'm doing this work, sometimes settings say to me, well, all of our children and families are white, so I don't think we need to do this work here. And I always say that is the perfect environment where this work should be done, because it's often the case that white children grow up to be white adults who are really scared and fearful about having conversations about race. And that's because that conversation has been off limits for them for so long. There is this socialization process that I think people who are racialized as white go through, where they're told to talk about race is impolite, or to notice one's skin color is impolite. And so this is where this colorblind approach is born from. This thing where you think, if I don't see color and I don't talk about color, it means it doesn't exist. And it's really, really damaging to do that, because if I come into a space and you don't see the color of my skin, you don't hear and recognize that I'm telling you I identify as a woman, it means that you're not seeing part of my identity. And my skin color isn't something I can take off and put back on, but it's also something that's integral to my everyday experience. It means that if you see my skin color, you recognize as well that there are going to but it also helps as well for me to feel seen and feel as though I belong, because you're recognizing me as a whole and not in part, because it makes you feel more comfortable.
Thank you, Liz. And we actually have another question, which this one was from Mark Brooks, and he said, one question is that only 3% of teachers working in early years education are male. How can we fix this? What impact does it have on young men, especially if they have no role models at home, including those from a BAME background?
So I think, Mark, what's really interesting is that if we're looking at, again, this umbrella term, BAME, what is BAME? Are we talking about Black? Are we talking about Black African? Are we talking about Black Caribbean? Are we talking about South Asian? If we're talking about South Asian, are we talking about people who are from Indian background, Pakistani background, Bangladeshi? So we have to start being really specific.
Sorry, everyone, for the delay. We hope to have Liz back with us soon. I think she's just looking into some difficulties with the internet. And I'm hoping she'll be right back with us. But thank you so much for the really interesting questions. We'll get right back to that one, Mark, once Liz is back. And I'm really looking forward to hearing her thoughts as well on sort of gender imbalance in terms of early education. I think that's a great question. And then we've also got a few more questions, I think, coming through, which is brilliant. So Holly's asked a question. She says, I work at a setting in a village which lacks diversity. I'm from Manchester and have grown up in a diverse environment. How can I ensure our children are seeing and valuing other cultures? So that's a really interesting one. We'll ask her that one when she's back in a few minutes, hopefully. Liz, you're back with us.
I was mid-flow then.
I know.
I was talking about the need to advocate for a range of...
Oh no, it's such a shame to have Liz cut off mid-flow. when she's answering the question so well. And Mark says, good point on different groups in response to what Liz was saying earlier. I was just going to read out another comment. Maya Peterson said, we have a free Lunar New Year resource on our website for early years practitioners created with and by East and Southeast Asian educators, as well as other resources and reading list. So that's a really nice one to know about for next time that you're celebrating Lunar New Year, which will be next year, obviously. What else have we got? I do hope that we'll get Liz back. Thank you for all of the comments you sent in so far. It's great having your questions. I think we'll probably just take a pause while we're waiting for Liz to return. Perhaps she's restarting her router and she'll be back with us once her connection's a bit better. We had a comment from the producer. He said there are some internet problems in Birmingham which are outside of our control. So that might be explaining why she's having some trouble joining. Hi Liz, thank you for your persistence.
I am persistent. I'm absolutely committed to making sure this conversation happens. Honestly, you're going to have to come out 3 million times and come back in. I don't know where we've got to.
So Mark had asked his question, which was about 3% of teachers working in early years education are male. And you were talking a bit about the importance of differentiating within the sort of BAME category and being specific about which ethnicities and heritages we're talking about. Are you still with us, Liz? Oh, it looks like we're having another challenge there. I remain optimistic that we will get to Mark's question. I think we'll just hold for a moment while we see how we can fix this. Hi Liz, that's looking better.
Let's try again. I'm so happy if people have stayed with the conversation and haven't disappeared.
I know. Thank you, everyone, for everyone who's here for sticking with us. So, so Mark's question about 3% of teachers working in early education being male. How can we fix this? Any thoughts on that one?
Right. So, as I was saying, thinking about the underrepresentation and thinking about the structures and the systems, that's the first thing that we need to really be challenging. We need to be specific when we're thinking about this umbrella term BAME, which I absolutely hate. What are we talking about when we're talking about BAME? Are we just lumping people who are not white together? I think that's a really dangerous approach. And also, how are people being invited to and feeling though they belong in the early years space if they are Black, if they are, South Asian, if they are East or Southeast Asian and they are male? How are they made to feel as though they belong in the early years? So we have a lot to do in terms of addressing systemic issues, because it isn't that there is a lack of men that want to work in the early years, but I think it's the way in which the early years is positioned and presented to a wide range of people, outside of being white and heterosexual, and in the early years, female. So I think there's a lot to address in terms of this systemic issues around, as I said, that pathway into working in the early years.
Thank you. And actually, we had another question just underneath from Holly, She says, I work at a setting in a village which lacks diversity. I'm from Manchester and have grown up in a diverse environment. How can I ensure our children are seeing and valuing other cultures?
Holly, use the internet. I mean, the internet is not a brilliant example today because it seems to be kind of letting us down. But I would always say use all of this technology that we have. We live in a technological age. Partner with a early years space, a nursery school in a more diverse part of the country, and think about the ways in which you can bridge that gap. Having play dates that are virtual, thinking about the children being able to see different ethnicities, different racialized identities, different cultures by using things like Zoom, making sure that you're integrating technology into your everyday. Play doesn't always have to be physical, play can be virtual, and we need to expand our knowledge and expand our experiences by thinking about how we bring technology in. It's in, the non-statutory and the statutory guidance about using technology. So I think that's always a good way of thinking about it.
Yeah, some really interesting and creative ideas there. Thank you. And we had a great question here as well from Hanifa Pervez. And she said, hi, Liz, you've done some fantastic work. Thank you for sharing. I was wondering whether you have dealt with pushback on the importance of this work and how have you dealt with those challenges?
Hey, Hanifa, thank you for this question. Of course, I've had pushback. I'm a Black woman talking about anti-racist practice, talking very directly to people who work in a sector that pride themselves on thinking that they're really kind and really nice, so we don't have a problem here. There's always going to be pushback. This is part of the job. Fortunately, unfortunately, it comes at a risk, of course, and I don't expect everybody to want to come into this space and have these kinds of conversations. What I have decided was that enough was enough. And I was bored of the same old. And I realized that in order for change to happen, it always is going to come at great risk. When you're telling a sector that they're not doing what they should be doing and you're challenging it head on, and you're talking about things like white supremacy, you're talking about things like racism, and you're talking about it not just from a research perspective, but from a lived experience perspective, it's always going to meet challenge. This is not work that I'm doing in isolation, though. Many people have done this work before me. I wouldn't be able to do this work had people not have done this. And I think it's really important to recognize this. What I'm doing is not brand new. This is something that has always been done. People who are on the fringes of society, who are racially minoritized, who are marginalized for whatever reason, have always been advocates for ensuring that their voice is heard. It has always come at great cost. It has always come at pushback. This work isn't easy, and that's why I said it needs a collaborative approach. It also needs people who are racialized as white in the space to talk about this, to take the action, to do what is necessary. The burden, of course, shouldn't fall on people who are racially minoritized. Unfortunately, it tends to be the case that it is, but it's really important, as I said, that your voice is as loud as it can be and that you're not put off by naysayers or people presenting that there's two sides of the conversation, two sides of the argument. Racism is wrong. We know that. We should all be working collectively to eradicate it. We also know the construct of race is man-made. There is actually no such thing as racial types. The impact of racism is very real. So to that end, if we know that the construct of race isn't real, it's man-made, we also know that we can dismantle it, but it's going to take many lifetimes and many generations to do that. This is work that is legacy work. Okay, it's not going to be fixed overnight. And I think a lot of people who come to this work, particularly people who are racialized as white, think there's going to be like a one fix solution. That's it. We'll do these 3 sessions with Liz. We'll go on an anti-racist course. We'll talk about anti-racism. We'll have a book club and then everything will be solved. No, this is legacy work and it's intergenerational. And the same way I talked about the ways in which white people perhaps have been socialized about conversations to do with race, it's the same way people, who are Black, South Asian, Southeast Asian, have been socialized to not perhaps talk about race because you don't want to upset the status quo. I'm only interested in creating, good trouble. We've heard this, and it's important that we recognize there is certain trouble that needs to be created. There are certain disruptions that need to happen. And we need to do that like now. We're already really too late to this, but we need to continue this momentum. This hasn't just happened as a result of Black Lives Matter in 2020. people on the peripheral have always been advocating and talking about the need for social justice and actually the need for human rights.
And actually, a comment that follows on has come from Stacey in the audience, and she said, "I love the point that Liz always makes about the fact that it's okay to make mistakes and get things wrong. We are a work in progress, and I hope through this education we approach this work with sincerity." So I just wondered if you had anything to respond to that.
Absolutely, yeah, and Stacey's absolutely right. I know Stacey's heard me talk a few times, and Stacey also is somebody who had I've worked with in a professional capacity and had the pleasure of having in my setting when I was a nursery manager. But me and Stacey would often talk about the need to just be okay with getting it wrong. Okay, just accept we're human. We're going to get things wrong. Once we've got things wrong, we move forward into the right direction. But we all have to stand to be corrected, and we have to understand what that feels like and really understand how that can help us navigate this conversation and the action that we need to take so that it's more successful. But I think there is this obsession with being perfect and always getting things right. And if we get things wrong, then we failed, where that doesn't seem to apply if we're working with children, does it? We actively encourage children to get things wrong. We actively encourage children to make mistakes. And when they do make mistakes, we encourage them to try again. We have to apply that same principle for us as adults in our learning. And that's why I say, as adults who are responsible for the care and education of children, we must position ourselves as the learners. Let children guide the way, actually. They can lead us, they can help us to understand and make sense of ourselves. We have to be prepared to be vulnerable in this work in the same way children are vulnerable. We have to be prepared to fall over and get back up. We have to be prepared to take another step. Because we're not running yet, we're all still crawling. And that's the reality of where we are with anti-racism, particularly in terms of early years.
That's a really helpful reminder. I'm always having this conversation with my daughter, who's 5, about it's okay to make mistakes, and it's good to sort of remind ourselves of that too as adults. Yeah. So we actually had a question as well that was submitted before this event from Sarah Fayette from Save the Children. And she said, to what extent does culture play an important role in the expectations of play between parents and children? Are you able to hear that okay, Liz?
Oh, we had a good run and now it's cutting out again, Louise.
Can you hear me all right?
That's the question.
Oh, can you hear me okay now, Liz? I'll say it again. She said, to what extent does culture play an important role in the expectations of play between parents and children?
Again, I think, it's really interesting when we're thinking about those initial conversations that we have with children and families when they join our early years setting. How are we spending time to find out about families' cultures, the ways in which people do things? We all do things differently. There are some things that have us kind of similar in our cultural beliefs and our cultural practices, but there are some things that are very different. So I always say, I don't come to this work and speak for all Black people. I come to this work and speak for Liz, speak as an early years educator, speak as a consultant, speak as a trainer. Yes, my racialized identity is that I'm Black. Yes, I'm British. Yes, I'm female. I am of Jamaican heritage, so to that extent, I'm Caribbean, but I do not speak for all Black people, which is to say there is a need to analyse and to understand individuality in these conversations. Cultures are not homogenous. As I said, if you're spending time to really find out about who the families are, what they do, what they like, what they don't like, what they do with their children at home, what they don't do with their children at home, you are eventually going to start finding out about the ways in which people do things. People, and that's how we have to start looking at it. It's not a homogenous approach. We cannot assume, as I said, that if you're of that particular racialized identity, if you're of that particular ethnicity, you do these, all things the same. And I'll give an example here. I'd said that the setting that I managed was predominantly Black and brown. There was huge and rich and vast levels of diversity that existed within my setting. Just because the setting in terms of the children and families were predominantly Black and brown, it didn't mean we did all things the same. There were lots of things that we had to make sure we found out from the individual families so that we could make sure that we were serving all of those children and all of those families. And we did that all of the time because we made it a priority. It meant that the teams that I employed were coming from very different and, again, vast ranges of backgrounds in terms of languages spoken, in terms of their own cultures, in terms of their own racialized identities. And it also meant that as a manager, I had to make sure that those practitioners, those educators came to the setting and were able to be themselves. And by that, I mean that in the very literal sense. You know, what are you bringing to this work? I want you to bring your individuality to this work. I want you to bring that nuanced level of your humanity and who you are to this work, because I want the children to experience diversity in its truest sense. So it meant that I had to spend a lot of time, not just in terms of kind of, you know, your generic staff development, but having conversations. So there were personal relationships there. And that happened all of the time because, you know, we're working in an industry and in a sector where staff turnover may be really high because of, again, structural and systemic things and issues around it being really low paid the early years. You know, as I said, things fluctuate all of the time. We have to be able to be equipped to deal with that ever-changing face of what the team might or could look like. So it meant that I had to invest time in getting to know, as I said, practitioners, educators. That should be a standard, I think. If you're a student and you're coming on placement, I have to make sure that I know you. What's your educational experience been like? Have you had a good, positive experience? What has the course been like that you're doing? If you're doing your MVQ level 2 or your MVQ level 3, if you're doing your early years degree, you know, what's that experience been like for you? So again, everything comes down to this word, relationships. I just think it's really overlooked, and we have to spend time to get to know all of our children, all of our families, all of them in a very, as I said, personal way. And don't worry about this, you know, the blurring of the lines of professional and personal. We're human. We are working in a care sector. It's an industry which requires us to come and be human and be empathetic and to be understanding and to have relationships that are rooted in wanting to find out how we best suit the needs of the children and the families.
Absolutely. And we actually had another question from Elle Hall. And she said, Liz, thank you for your persistence with the internet issues. We are still here. My question, how would you navigate your way in a leadership role where your voice is being heard but not understood?
I think this is where we come to the conversations around strength in numbers and solidarity and support. And I think there needs to be some programs. It's one of the things that I'm working on at the moment, actually, around mentorship and around support and guidance, and thinking about where we get our fuel from. Are we around people who are charging us up and empowering us to have these conversations and to be persistent in the conversations that we're having, or are we kind of giving up at the first hurdle? Because it is really easy to give up, because this work requires you to be constantly energetic and constantly persistent, and that takes a toll. And we do have to kind of think about how we ensure there is an element of self-care within that as well, because it's not easy. But I think mentorship and support outside of the professional environment, outside of the workplace, is really necessary. And if need be, advocacy in the workplace. So who are you working alongside? Who is in your team that you can draw on to support you when you go to have those conversations, so they're even more amplified, so that senior leadership understand how and why these matters are important to you? Who are you bringing with you to have those conversations in the office? Who are you making sure stands by you and tells you it's fine? Don't be upset, like, I've got you. Just hearing those words, you know, in a professional capacity, I've got you. It's so important. So we're having to strengthen ourselves in all angles, from all sides, in the workplace, outside of the workplace, in our lunch breaks, making sure we take that downtime, making sure we're listening to something that's, you know, empowering and restores our faith in humanity. Because what we're doing actually is hope work. You know, we hope that things will change. That's why we do what we do. That's why we have these conversations. That's why I do what I'm doing. There is an element of hope, as honest as I am about the pessimism actually that surrounds some of this and some of the pushback and the hurdles. What keeps me going, what's kept me persisting with the internet issues is there's hope. I'm going to get through this. We're going to have this conversation through hell and high water. We're going to have it, but it requires us to not give up, and we have to have that element in what we're doing, particularly if we feel like we're not being heard, and if we start to understand the reasons why we might not be, you know, being heard. How are we thinking about communication? what does communication look like? What does healthy communication look like? And how are we making sure that, as I said, we continue to be persistent?
And on that note, obviously we all need communities of people to support us and inspire us. So I wanted to ask you the question, which other early years experts and practitioners do you look to for inspiration?
Woo! Who do I look to for inspiration? So I'm going to start not with an early years practitioner, but I'm going to start with the late, great Stuart Hall. And if you don't know who Stuart Hall is, I really implore you to go and find out. Stuart Hall had written some phenomenal things around race and social justice and equity and occupying spaces in the UK and abroad. Stuart Hall was born in Jamaica and looked really at kind of culture and society. So I'm going to start with Stuart Hall, first of all. Please go and find out about Stuart Hall. In terms of early years educators, I always kind of pay homage to Laura Henry Elaine because of the phenomenal work that Laura has done in the early years in laying some of these foundations and the things that I'm doing now. Dr. Stella Louise, a phenomenal early years practitioner who's done a lot of work around the power of observation and the importance of schemas and thinking about why we need to observe those things with children. I always think of Jamal Carley Campbell as a Black male practitioner in this space, and similarly, Joss Cambridge Simmons, who I know you'd had a conversation with recently, Louise, in terms of just, again, the power of representation and being in the space and being authentically themselves in this space as well. I think of the work of anti-racist activist and campaigner Jane Lane, who had written a book called Young Children and Racial Justice. Brilliant work. Jane has long been doing this work in terms of social justice and the importance of social justice for children. And lastly, this is going to be a hard one, but I'm trying to kind of think who I've been looking at very recently. No, I don't want to be in this space of just like pondering forever. Let me leave it there with the names that I've thrown into the space.
I'm sure that was an excellent roll call, which gave everyone lots to look into. And just before we wrap up, we had a final question from Keisha Evans, and she said, "Hi Liz, would you suggest how would you suggest approaching race by doing activities with children, taking into consideration their age and development?"
Observation. What are children talking about? How are children talking about difference? How are children talking about themselves? How are children talking about the children that they see or the practitioners? Don't approach this as a lesson. I don't want anybody to go into their setting and be like, today we are talking about race. Today we are talking about anti-racism. What you need to do is position yourself as the learner. Listen to children. What are children talking about? How are you thinking about when you're doing that activity to do with self-portraits and you're giving children, if you like, a selection of different paints, a selection of different crayons? What colours are the children going for? How are they using that? How is that providing you with a springboard to then start talking about skin colour? Are you providing the paints, or are you using the process of getting children to select, does this paint match my skin, or does it match your skin, or whose skin does it look like? Are we thinking expansively about the ways in which we are presenting activities to do with self-portraits and recognising self and mirror play? Are we using those as springboards to have conversations about, you know, as I said, in a literal sense, children look at skin colour. That's the thing that they notice. That's the thing they'll talk about. Instead of thinking, right, this is adult initiated, I'm going to go in and I'm going to speak about race. It's about positionality. Position yourself as the learner, not the teacher.
Fantastic, Liz. Thank you so much. Some great ideas there. And I think we've reached the end of our time. So I just wanted to say a huge thank you, Liz, for joining us for such an interesting discussion. And thank you everyone who joined in the audience and also came up with a really interesting range of questions there. So thank you so much, everyone, for coming. I'm just going to let you know, please do sign up to Nesta's newsletter if you want to be notified about future Nesta Talks 2 events. And our next event for a Fairer Start mission is going to be with Aisha Small, who is Head of Change for Education and Families at the Youth Endowment Fund on the 28th of April. So we'd love you to join us there as well. But finally, just thank you so much for Liz. It's been great to talk to you today, and hope to see you all again soon.